Welcome back to Lesson 5. Steve Jarrard, your host. We're studying the return of Christ. Some of this stuff I know is getting a little nitty-gritty, cutting it close as far as getting deep into the Word, and you're going to have to go back later and look these passages up and study them out for yourself. We had concluded with an understanding that in Luke 21, up until verse 24, Jesus was talking about the contemporaries. He said, this people and the local area where the Jews resided in Israel. And then afterwards, the language totally changes. He's talking about things going around the world, coming upon the earth. And in verse 32, he says, truly this generation will not pass away until all things take place. That, to me, doesn't sound like language that has to do with the destruction of the temple. Obviously, since 70 AD, all things have not taken place. So Jesus is talking about another people. And it becomes really clear, and I wrote this on the board so you can see it. Let's contrast verse 23 with verse 32 in Luke 21. He says, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. Now, I told you in the last lesson, I wrote it down here so you can go back and look it up. In your Strong's, 5129, the word is written out, if I'm not a Greek scholar, but it looks like tuto to me. That's talking about his contemporaries. And everywhere else in the Gospels, when Jesus says this people, these people, he's talking about those contemporaries, and that's the Greek word. But in this verse, 32, which follows the destruction of the temple, he says, truly, now in your King James, New American Standard, it says, this generation, not this people, but this generation, that should be a tip-off right there, will not pass away. And the word is number 3778. It's the only time that we find that change. And it's the word hutos. And when you look up the definition, one of the definitions is clearly the word that, or they. That people. What people? The people that saw Jerusalem no longer trampled underfoot of the Gentiles. I graduated from high school in 1966. I wasn't a Christian then. I could have cared less. But the year after is when the Six-Day War occurred, and I've got some tapes and DVDs, and I have personal testimony from a Brooklyn Jew who went over to be in the battle, in the fight, and he was shot on the first day. But the reports that were coming back from wounded soldiers and some of the officers that came to see them were of miraculous signs and wonders taking place. And when I do a full presentation, I like to show at least one of these tapes or DVDs with some personal testimonies of soldiers, commanders, tank commanders, of men who saw miraculous events take place on the battlefield. God had His hand in that battle. And in 1967, the Jews reclaimed this generation, which should have been translated because of the context, that generation would not pass away. Now, the key here is, what's a biblical generation? Now, this is the million-dollar question. And been a lot of articles written, a lot of back and forth as to what constitutes a biblical generation. Well, one plain biblical answer to that is found with God dealing with Moses and the children of Israel during the Exodus. It took them 40 years from the fighting age of 20 years of age upwards to come to the point where they were ready to go into the promised land, and God said, I will raise up a new generation. Well, it took 40 years for him to raise up a new generation. And again, going back to when I graduated from high school in '66, the year before, I was a little bit younger than 20. So I could be a milestone, a marker for what constitutes a generation, because I was alive to see that, and I was just, I wasn't quite 20 then, but I was pushing it. So there's a lot of information out there as to what constitutes a generation. Well, if we just take 40 as a means to start with, we come to, if you add 40 to 1967, it brings us to 2007. Well, what that does is effectively cancels out all these prior predictions of Christ's return, because all these people going all the way back to the early 1800s, the early 1900s, even up to present day, May 21st, I believe it was, of 2011, well, let's not throw that one in the ringer right now. That's a whole other story. But these prior predictions of Christ's return have not taken into account these statements and these events, these prophecies being fulfilled. And they've only just now been fulfilled, and we've only just passed the mile mark of 2007. We're at 2010, December 30th right now. So we're a few years past what many consider to be a biblical generation. I don't want to get too bogged down into the details, but there are several very interesting passages that apply to where we are right now in what I believe to be God's time frame. And when we get into some of these other subject matters, we will be getting a little closer and more detailed as to how these other scriptures apply to why God didn't come back in 2007. Now, I think that there's plenty of scripture that shows us that God, I'm just going to tell you from my heart, what God's about to do, I don't think He really relishes the thought, because we're talking about 2/3 of the world's population perishing from war and hunger, starvation, disease, all kinds of events that are not going to be, they're not fun to even think about. And though God has to do this, I believe that He is forestalling as long as He can. There's some scripture in 2 Peter chapter 3 that talks about that God is long-suffering, that none should perish. And I think what we're experiencing right now, 2010, is in fact God's long-suffering, that He doesn't wish for any to perish. If you have me to your church, bring this up. We'll discuss this more in detail. He goes on to say, and I hope I made this clear enough by putting it on the board, two different Greek words here in play. He said, verse 34, be on guard that your hearts may not be weighted down with dissipation, which means a hangover from drinking, and drunkenness, and the worries of life. Now this is very critical, the worries of life. And that day come on you suddenly like a trap. And those of you that have mice and rats, you know what I just did. That's the mouse trap going off underneath the cabinet. For it will come upon all those who dwell, not in Jerusalem, on the face of all the earth. But be on the alert at all times, praying, in order that you may have strength to escape. all these things that are about to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. One of the operative words here is about to take place. There are things happening right now in the world to do with the economy, our takeover of our government, our food crops are being tampered with, natural disasters. There's so many things going on right now that really, if I weren't a Christian, I would be scared to death of what's coming. Now, most people aren't plugged in. They don't take the time to listen to alternative sources of information. And, you know, Channel 5, Channel 2, Channel 11, 46 is where most people get their information. But if you go to alternate sources, you'll find out things are not well, people. This country is sick. And it's on a slippery slope, and it's going down fast. And there are powers that be, and we get into this in some of our other lessons, the powers that be, particularly when we talk about the New World Order and the One World Government, that there's a takeover. It's a hostile takeover. There's no bullets going to be involved. It's basically going to be an economic takeover that's going to bring the world to the brink of destruction. About to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Well, I only find one place in the Bible where there's any group of people, Christians, who are standing before the Son of Man. In Revelation, John saw in chapter 7, verse 9, "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands." This is clearly, to me, speaking of the catching up of the church, which we'll be getting into more in depth later. And that's who this people that Christ is referring to in Luke 21. Let me get back to it here. "Keep on the alert at all times, praying in order that you may have strength to escape all these things which are about to take place and to stand before the Son of Man." Well, that day which comes upon you suddenly like a trap, well, that obviously wasn't 70 AD. Jesus is clearly talking about a different generation at a different time in history, the generation of which many from all tribes and nations and tongues and people will be standing before His throne. And that day will come upon all those who dwell on the face of all the earth. And the question is, are you going to be ready when that day comes? Now, many people will say, well, yeah, as long as you're a Christian, you're ready. Well, I've got the series that I do in Matthew 25 that speaks of the 10 virgins. Those 10 virgins in context represent Christ's church extant that's alive, standing on planet Earth at the time of His coming. And only half His church, 5 wise, are going to be ready when the door is opened. And the question is, do you have oil in your lamp? And are you ready? Or is that day going to come upon you suddenly like a trap? Well, hopefully these series will alert you and awaken you to what's coming very soon. I believe within 2 years, maybe less. And we get a little bit closer. Each lesson that we do of the 10 puts us closer to recognizing when Christ is going to return. So I hope this has helped you, and we probably conclude this series right now. What is the sign of your coming? And next series of lessons will have to do with the sabbatical pattern. Thank you.